excited to introduce you to postdoc Stephen Slota, who is based in the iSchool and also working with Good Systems. His research interests include knowledge infrastructure, information policy, and the ethics and values surrounding data science, as well as AI. Stephen is presenting today his research that has been nominated for the best short paper at this year's iConference. And at the end of his talk, we will have time for you to ask questions. So I will go ahead and turn it over to Stephen.
All right, thank you, Tara. I'm going to start sharing my screen now. Thank you. I'm really excited to be one of the inaugural speakers for this series, and I can tell you that it's all uphill from here. All right. So the title of this talk is Something New versus Tried and True, Ensuring Innovative AI is Good AI. And to kind of start to lead us in, we are a society and a culture in America that prizes innovation, and especially technical innovation, above almost all else. Examples of like NICE, the American Technological Sublime, or the Digital Sublime by Moscow, and other works in kind of transhuman scholarship will highlight the role of technological development in making people better, in making society better, and in making the world better. However, given that this kind of drive to innovation exists, there have always been kind of critiques of it. You might be familiar with Winner's the Whale and Reactor, kind of searching for limits in the age of high technology, averting catastrophe and risky technologies, or even our media. Dystopian science fiction presents a kind of negative and kind of a negative concern about the role of innovation in our society. And the role of innovation is such that it's a drive to innovate, or innovation is kind of seen as being an inevitability, something that we can't avoid and something that needs to be managed and thought about and controlled after the fact, but not something that we consider whether or not it's a good or a bad thing at the moment of inception. And significant portions of our institutions, our values, and our policies are oriented towards that production of novelty. We have far fewer that are concerned with ensuring that ongoing innovation is responsible, manageable, or socially positive. And so that's kind of the motivation for this analysis and where this talk is coming from. How do we think about innovation in the world? How do we think about innovation as this driving force that is culturally pervasive and present throughout a lot of our technology design, our policy, and our institutions? Especially when we know that these critiques exist and we know that there is room for concern about unchecked innovation, concern about the drive to innovate, concern that we might not be making the best things that we can when we're designing technology. So it's in light of this that we kicked off our research. And we planned our study with some assumptions drawn from the literature. That issues of design, policy, and practice are knotted together from design inception and are mutually co-constructed. That human values, which is pretty much anything that we think is important in our lives, in the kind of mode of Schwartz, human values are both embedded in design and work to structure our design approaches. That values can be productive constraints in technology design, and the tensions between different values and the consideration of values in design can be revelatory as to the perception, use, and consequence of technology and the regulation and legislation that acts upon it. So with these assumptions in place, we designed our study to engage 3 different populations of stakeholders, stakeholders being like very broadly defined as anyone that has an interest or is affected by technologies of artificial intelligence and machine learning. So around these issues of artificial intelligence and machine learning, we identified three different populations that we interviewed. The first were technology stakeholders that could have been drawn from industry, artificial intelligence and machine learning research and development, industry or academic artificial intelligence and machine learning design and implementation, and people in strictly research roles in academia. We also interviewed 8 legal stakeholders, drawn both from law and legal practice and academia, and 10 policy stakeholders, which came out of nonprofits and charitable organizations, people with either bureaucratic or elected roles in governments, and again, from academia, the people who are interested in this topic as a research area, for a total of 26 interview participants. Our interview design was built with the idea of addressing knowledge asymmetries about the scope and capacity of specific AI and machine learning technologies between those who work directly with the technology and those who worked with it in their role of either policy or law. So for this technology stakeholder interviews, we deployed critical incident technique, asked them about their values and the ethical, legal, and policy consequence of artificial intelligence and machine learning. From these interviews, we developed our strategy to address knowledge asymmetries between technology, law, and policy stakeholders in our interview group. Drawing upon the technology interviews, we identified 6 specific well-understood technologies to ask our legal and policy stakeholders about. We asked them about what they thought the ethical, legal, and policy consequence of each of those technologies was, and asked them about the ethical, legal, and policy consequences of artificial intelligence and machine learning writ large, or as kind of in a broad sense. The technologies we identified for our legal and policy stakeholders were autonomous vehicles, organ transplant priority lists, call centers and automated agents, bank loan decisions, medicine and diagnosis, and criminal sentencing decisions. These technologies came up in the technology stakeholder interviews. They were relatively well understood, and most especially those of us conducting the interviews were able to effectively represent the kind of scope and capacity of each of these technologies when we were interviewing our legal and policy stakeholders. And thus we were trying to address that asymmetry in knowledge between, especially about that technology, what it can do, and more importantly, what it can't, to keep our interviews with our legal and policy stakeholders well focused around well understood technologies. Following these interviews, we analyzed them through thematic analysis, inductively identifying major themes, 3 of which I'm going to be reporting today. And all 3 were significant values tensions arising from this drive to innovate. Innovation versus reliability, innovation versus security, privacy, and control, and innovation versus regulation. And I'll be going into more detail on each of these coming up. But perhaps less interestingly, but a very important finding to present first, our participants consistently valued innovation as a social good in its own right. Much like in the mode of the digital sublime and the American technological sublime, most of our participants assumed without critique and without consideration that innovation was a good thing, that the production of novelty was something worth doing, and that the production of novelty and innovation, especially in the technology space, was something inevitable, something that was going to happen no matter what anyone did. And all we really had control over was where the innovation occurred, not that innovation was going to occur. So it was a force to be directed, a force to be managed, and something to respond to, rather than something that you need to put extra effort into making happen. And much like the remainder of those 3 book covers I showed you at the beginning, unchecked, unrestrained, and unconsidered innovation was still seen as problematic and something that did need management. Innovation was a force that needed to be directed. And so from that, we have a series of these value tensions that came up as themes in our interview analysis. Innovation versus reliability. Unchecked and unrestrained innovation was seen to increase the risk of recapitulating and reproducing prior biases, prior discriminatory conditions. It had the potential to produce counterintuitive, unexpected, and societally negative outcomes. But even among these interviews, there was a relatively nuanced take. For example, this quote from a legal stakeholder that we interviewed: prison sentencing, or sentencing in general, has been a deeply flawed, terribly unreliable system from as far back as the beginning of history. The attempt to use technology is an attempt to do away with human frailty and biases. At the same time, those are extraordinarily flawed technology measures. And so this is a little bit of a nuance on this tension between reliability and innovation. When building a system that's intended to perform better than humans, performing at the level of humans is no longer a consistent measure for that technology. So we expect the AI to do better. And when it doesn't, we see it can be seen as a failure of innovation or a failure of the technology itself. But still kind of at the core here is that we want to innovate and we want new things. And when those things don't work the way we expect, or when those things reproduce a negative condition that we were trying to address, they're seen as significantly more of a failure than the initial condition that they arose from. Another values tension we addressed was innovation versus security, privacy, and control. And throughout our interviews, security was seen to be as fundamentally in tension with rapid innovation, that the work for security and the work for innovation was almost a zero-sum game where either you could be secure or you could be innovative. Either you could have something that is private or you can have something that is innovative and at the cutting edge of the technology and design world. They saw that need for expansive growing data sets significantly risked abrogating personal privacy, and that innovating fast and especially moving products to market fast enables bad actors or malicious uses of technology. Everyone in this room is probably familiar with Microsoft's very poor attempt at the Tay chatbot that was released without controls against saying things that are racist or being trained to be a semi-genocidal, racist, and very aggressive and crude bot. So like that is the tension. You want to innovate, you want to try and create chatbots, but there's kind of this inflation of the negative outcomes. Tay not working was seen by many people to be an indictment against the use of AI and machine learning writ large, or at least like a microcosm of the sorts of negative consequences we can expect from AI and machine learning. And so this quote from the legal stakeholder, that's a question right now. Do we value innovation or do we value the protection of individuals? That's a policy choice. And note that this stakeholder didn't say that you could do both at once, that you are either pushing for innovation or allowing innovation to happen, or you're restraining innovation by protecting individuals. So that was the policy choice in this legal stakeholder's mind. And this technology stakeholder was very aware of bad actors and malicious users of technologies. He said there are ways that technologies, if put in the wrong hands, can be used for bad purposes. And I think finding ways to create safeguards to that is the concern. So throughout these interviews and across the stakeholder groups, they saw a tension between this drive to innovate and the motivating force of innovation and the desire for security, privacy, and control of the technology once it is out in the world and once it's deployed. And finally, and this is perhaps a more complex theme, is the values tension between innovation and regulation. And among our stakeholder groups, and divided in what I hope you'll agree is a very interesting ways, they presented a set of limiting factors for the ongoing development of artificial intelligence and machine learning in the world. On the one hand, we had a set of stakeholders who said that waiting for regulation causes anti-competitive delay, that regulation stifles innovation, that regulation limits data sharing and availability, and that ethical requirements even present similar limitations to all of that kind of regulation. Another one of our stakeholder groups regularly asserted that potential impact is an empty category for design, that you can't assess impact in advance, and that it's very difficult to know the environment before you create the technology. And it's very hard to tell what is going to happen once it's out there in the world and deployed. Similarly, insufficient contextual knowledge was seen to limit effective innovation, that regulation and standards were actually necessary for effective data sharing and data availability and the breaking down of data silos, and that unknown or unassessed risk, the sort that you can do with effective regulation and legislation, limits implementation and growth of artificial intelligence and machine learning. And now I had a certain expectation prior to these interviews, and that was that the concerns on the left side, where regulation was seen as problematic and technology was seen as moving forward effectively, would be the technology stakeholders. And that the right side, where more regulation was seen as necessary and that regulation was seen as enabling design, development, and deployment of artificial intelligence and machine learning when done correctly, I would have expected would have been held by the policy and legal stakeholders. However, it was quite the opposite. The legal and policy stakeholders were much more likely to find regulation and legislation to be problematic. And the technology stakeholders were much more likely to identify gaps in legislation and regulation that could enable their work. It seemed when we were working through our analysis of these interviews that the area with which people were more comfortable was the one that they saw to be more problematic, and the area more distant from them, again, on the other side of that knowledge asymmetry, was the area that they saw as being less problematic and more enabling of the ongoing development of AI. So for example, this legal stakeholder said, I think we need to let AI innovate. I think we need to avoid rushing to regulate AI, which unfortunately is happening. Another legal stakeholder told me AI is based on data. A lot of data is data that's pooled together from different sources. And a lot of that data is data that in Europe and Canada, at the very least, is protected by privacy laws. And right now, those laws are completely incompatible with the development of AI. So these legal stakeholders and the policy stakeholders as well, I know both these quotes were from legal ones, but both the legal and policy stakeholders found that the process of innovation and design was relatively unproblematic, but the existence of regulation was a significant and very troubling limiting factor in the ongoing development of AI and machine learning. On the other hand, this technology stakeholder told me the trade-off is not technological. It could be legal. It could be from the risk mitigation perspective. And an informed end user can make their decisions not based on technicalities of the machine learning system, but based on the impact that the products will have once integrated into their environment. However, we don't know their environment. We tried to, but we don't. And so this technology stakeholder, in a very interesting way, pointed again to this knowledge asymmetry, his lack of knowledge about the environment of use of his product and his kind of inability to assess what its impact is going to be. Just with his technological knowledge. So that kind of knowledge asymmetry between the legal and policy stakeholders and the technology stakeholders seem to significantly inform their perception of how AI development and machine learning development was limited, enabled, or even interacting with regulation and legislation, especially when it came to the actual implementation and use of that technology. And so from this, we can say a few things. Regulation may not on its own limit innovative practice, and may, by restricting certain approaches, actually promote novel designs in the light of those restrictions. These are drawn from studies of the GDPR in Europe in healthcare and in blockchain development, both of which found that the competing values, or the values that went into the system, were far more often constraints on the design of the system than the existence of regulation and legislation. And in fact, a different study found that efforts to support innovation through regulation and legislation often fail to account for the full diversity of stakeholder interests, and therefore are not as successful as they might hope to be, considering how central the values of the designers are to this process and to the innovation process. And so I'm going to call back to Jackson et al.'s design policy knot, where we have design policy and practice fundamentally interlinked and mutually co-constructing each other from the very inception of the design process. Drawing on this study, we want to, I would add intervening values happening at the nexus of design policy and practice, and intervening values that are non-endogenous to the system that's being created. These intervening values sit at this intersection and themselves are intersectional across a lot of issues of identity and institution, and play a fundamental role in guiding design very early on, when people are considering how it might be reactive to policy, how it might adjust practice, and how to design it as well. And so kind of moving beyond from that, the dynamics of artificial intelligence and machine learning and use arise in part from a complex set of intervening values at the intersection of design policy, which policy I'm using includes regulation and legislation, and practice, and that the knowledge asymmetries that we identified in our interviews play a significant role in how design and regulation are understood to influence the progress of AI. And note that the scale I used on this slide in the image is very specifically comparing apples and oranges. None of these sets of stakeholder groups really seem to be in a position to better understand the landscape of technology innovation and policy than any other. They just had different knowledge, which shaded how they understood the development of artificial intelligence and machine learning, and how they understood its interaction with that motivating force of innovation that is so pervasive and present, especially in the Western context. This discourse of innovation, regulation, legislation, and the kind of support or management of innovation can result in productive complexities in the mode of Katie Shilton's values levers paper that can contribute to creating effective and socially positive AI. And the reduction of knowledge, and we hold that the reduction of knowledge asymmetries among AI stakeholders, conceived in a fairly broad sense, could similarly potentially produce more nuanced negotiations between regulatory action and the drive to innovate. Thank you, everyone. Does anyone have any questions? And I'm going to leave my screen shared for now. Let me know if you want me to switch back to just my face.
Yes, thank you so much. And I'll help kind of navigate the question and answer process if people want to raise their hands, or you can put something in the chat. If you have a question, just let me know. I will start us off. I had a question, just very basic, being a little bit unfamiliar with this area. How did you define or assess knowledge asymmetry?
Well, and I'm going to stop screen sharing now, if that's okay, so you can see my pretty face while I answer. So we presumed at the beginning that knowledge asymmetries would be present, that people who were experts in technology design would have more knowledge about the capacity and scope of their technologies than people who are in the business of law and policy in one way or another. And so we designed our initial interviews with the goal of helping to address that knowledge asymmetry. The following knowledge asymmetries arose from how people talked during the interviews and arose in the coding process. So where it was evident that someone felt expertise in an area or told us that he didn't understand this or wasn't sure about what was happening here or couldn't see the consequence of that, we identified as a place where there was less knowledge here than we had seen in other interviews. And they happened to, in this context, especially around innovation, very conveniently for my analysis, cluster along those stakeholder groups in a way that was really similar to what we predicted. So that was nice to see, yes.
Thanks. Anyone else? Just take yourself off mute and ask your question. Feel free to just jump right in.
Can I go ahead? Am I?
Yes, please.
All right, cool. So thanks for the talk, Steve. So I have been thinking, and the way I approach this issue or this line of inquiry is to always think about the very human individualistic drive to innovate, which is like so innate.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm thinking of the wheel, for example, when I say that. And then secondly, alongside that drive is the notion of experiential learning from failures. Like what you make, you tend to try it out in the real world and you notice the failures and then you make improvements on your design. So these two things are on one side. On the other side, there is, unlike other living organisms on the earth, we have a body of knowledge to learn from. We are not entirely dependent on experiential learning. Like we don't necessarily need to fail each time to learn to design a better thing. So, and this is an abstract question, but I would love to hear your thoughts on how could we reconcile? How can we reconcile on the one hand a very compelling drive to innovate on an individual level, and on the other hand a system that we have in place, like a system of knowledge, thousands of years of wisdom, that things can fail and this is the way to avoid things that fail in a very spectacular way. So yeah, just your thoughts. in your thinking?
Thank you. That is a really interesting question. And by the way, in case no one noticed, I feel like I should also thank Nitin for his contribution to this project. He is a listed co-author here. Very, very useful help, and we're still sometimes talking about the data. All right, so first, I agree with you that this is a really fundamental drive, and that the desire to innovate for the sake of novelty may be among the most human things about being human. Or maybe one of the things that is most distinctive when comparing humans with other species that we share the world with. And we already have some of that implicit knowledge about how to kind of manage the consequence of a new design through experimentation, through small scale testing, like through that laboratory translation model that Latour talks about in the pasteurization of France. A lot of those are different steps to make sure we understand what the unmodified, unvariable dynamics of a thing are as we move it from laboratory to field, for example. But those often tend to fail in unusual and unpredictable ways in the artificial intelligence and machine learning space. In one small part, because the outcomes of machine learning often have the very significant weight in terms of how persuasive they are, a very significant persuasive weight, but are not necessarily visible or interpretable in their actual operation. So we can see something negative happening, but have very little idea of how it happens. Second, when they're deployed, especially in decision-making contexts, they tend to have inherited a lot of, I guess you'd call it authority, that came from much more predictable computing systems that have existed in the past. And so while we have a lot of the knowledge on how to manage and scale up, in this specific environment, innovation is more risky because of the relative obscurity of the operation of the systems that are being deployed, and the weight of authority that comes without a really significant account of, I'm completely blanking on the word, of their uncertainty. I was very uncertain on the word uncertainty. So without a significant account of their uncertainty and how to assess and understand their uncertainty, which is one of the reasons you would point at the knowledge asymmetries. People for whom artificial intelligence and machine learning is fundamentally their work have a good sense of how they are uncertain and how things can end up unpredictable. But a lower circuit court judge who is deploying the, I almost feel bad for the company that designed that sentencing software, because among us in academia, we have consistently torn them to shreds for several years. But if I'm a lower circuit court judge using that software, I am not going to be able to parse that, like, this is an unrepresentative sample population that is producing this trend that's being reported to me, and I need to adjust for that. The judges tended to follow disproportionately the advice of the decision support software, and people in general tend to disproportionately abide by the decision support results. So I think the reason why our kind of ongoing knowledge on how to innovate safely, or at least how to innovate with at kind of slowly increasing scales from laboratory to field, might not fully apply the way they have in the past, or might have kind of problematic implications when something is at the scale, the kind of inherited apparent authority and level of obscurity that a lot of AI and machine learning, especially in decision support, tends to do. Was that a good answer? Do you have follow-up?
Yes, definitely. I think I can immediately latch on to obscurity, decision making, and one of the other things that I'm banking on again as really helpful points to think about. Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I see that James has his hands up. James?
Hey, yeah, thanks. Great talk. Really interesting work. Glad to hear about it. I have a question that is related to methods and to existing literature. So basically what I'm curious about is, how were these findings different from what you may have found when reviewing existing literature? Or how are they different from what you may have found if you did something like, say, look at discourses in social media or in fora or in other sorts of print representations of people in this area of conversation. Basically, I'm just curious, did anything different coming out speaking with these folks that might not have come across when you read their books or their articles or look at what they say to one another, on Twitter?
Thank you. That is a really interesting question, and one that I considered when I was writing on this phase of the paper. In part, where this study is kind of distinctive from prior work that considers innovation, which, by the way, the field of innovation studies I have found to be fairly frustrated, because it feels always more concerned with how do we lower barriers to innovation, and never has that kind of critical appeal. But among the kind of social science folks and the people who are critical, and media studies especially, can be very critical of that kind of drive to innovate. Among those, there was little situatedness in the minds of people who are actually in a position to modify the direction of innovation as it's going out into the world. And while we did identify a number of knowledge asymmetries among our stakeholder groups, it's reasonable to say that the majority of these people are some level of expert in their specific slice of artificial intelligence and machine learning technology. I mean, the technology stakeholder might be exclusively researching natural language processing and might not feel like very confident in predictive analytics, but still an expert in that space, and still someone who, as part of being an expert and a stakeholder in that space, has considered these as a fundamental part of their work, or something that they consider at the moment of their work. And that window into the minds of stakeholders who are actually in a position to adjust the progress of AI and machine learning gives us, well, it doesn't necessarily tell us entirely new things about innovation in the world. It does point out at a very human level how these things are negotiated in daily work of technology design, and of the design of regulation, legislation, and various policy structures around artificial intelligence, machine learning in the world. Was that close to what you were asking? I'm sorry.
Sure. Although I guess I was more just wondering if there were any specific sort of acute differences. Say I reviewed the literature and they say XYZ in the articles, but when I talk to them, they say ABC instead. I was just curious if anything like that sort of emerged.
There were, and I apologize that I don't have them clearly in my head. I mean, there are articles that deviate from this view of innovation, especially when you start to look into like the management and organization literature, or economics of innovation. It was actually far more difficult to find any of these critiques of innovation in the world. And where we really differ is that even among these critiques of innovation, they still kind of have that human value of innovation as being a positive thing. We still want to move forward. We want to move forward the right way. And in our analysis and presentation, we're reporting that value, it might be a bit nuanced, but we're reporting that value existed in our respondents and our interviewees, but it's not something that we ourselves assumed at the start of the study. And it's not something that is an assumption for our analysis as we go into it. So it exists in the world. We saw it in our interviewees. It's not something we hold to ourselves, but we were interested in exploring that dynamic. So I guess that's where we could really slice off a little bit different from like Winner's the Whale in the Reactor, or Averting Catastrophe, or whatever.
Got it. Hey, thank you very much. Great talk.
Thank you. You're muted, Tara.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, I thought I was unmuted. I'm not sure what my screen is doing here. Fan, do you have a question?
Yeah, thanks. Hey, great talk. But I'm picking words from your previous response actually to Nitin's question, and that was a great question as well. So I'm thinking about, because you said something very interesting. You said the inherited authority of AI that from perhaps previous, earlier computing systems. And I kind of want to unpack that. How does inheritance come from? Do you think it's from discourse by discourse or by, I don't know, factish or some other possible mechanisms? Could you unpack that a little bit?
Sure, I'd be happy to unpack it. And I'd first like to kind of contextualize that statement in that it was a bit of kind of a speculation. They definitely seem to inherit the authority of more predictable systems, but I have not personally looked into precisely how that happens. However, in the studies that looked at how the judges were using the sentencing software, and an old maxim that my advisor used to repeat to me over and over again was that numbers beat no numbers every time, regardless of the quality of those numbers. And so there's kind of an authoritative and argumentative weight that comes from being able to present something that calls on the authority of a large pile of data, or that looks fundamentally the same as a device you have heavily trusted for a long time. Like when I look something up on Google Maps, I am much less concerned as to whether major roads have moved in the time since I've looked at the map less. I've become accustomed, and I've become accustomed in an ongoing pattern of trusting the information that's being presented to me. And so when you kind of import that trust of your device and the trust in the information that your device is bringing to you to that courtroom setting, make it operate in a completely and fundamentally different way than anything you've worked with in the past, but still give it to you in kind of the same UI. I think more than saying it's inherited the authority from a more predictable technology is that there's a lot of slippage between the uncertainty present in decision support software and the uncertainty present in Wikipedia.
Huh. I think it's a great answer actually, and you also mentioned that your same UI and those could all be pieces that are working there, and I think it is a very interesting process. Anyway, thought provoking. Thanks.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question. Blake has his hand up.
Great, thanks a lot, and thanks for having me. So I'm a prospective computer science PhD student for next fall. So glad you guys have been really open with this. You alluded to this, information asymmetry, right, between let's say the technology developers, the AI developers, and let's say legal experts. It seems like there's some combination you're alluding to that we could perhaps bridge that information asymmetry. I'm curious what you think that would look like. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, there are a few parts. An upcoming and future paper drawn from this research might have a lot to do with our interviews also ask questions about education and training in considering like resolving values, trade-offs in design, and thinking about ethics as they're in the business of building technology or building legislation and regulation. And what we found was that the vast majority of our respondents were extremely unconfident in the training that they had. They either felt it was too heady, philosophical, and distance from their day-to-day experience to be a meaningful guide, or they felt that they just had insufficient introduction to anything that would help them really have that kind of prior assessment of their work, or anything that would really give them the skills as necessary. Ethical training in organizations was often cast as a fill-in-the-blank rote activity that didn't actually provide any training or new knowledge. So in one part, training would be a very good address of these issues. Another is we are in a place where we have fewer kind of mental models of AI working in the world than we do of just computing working in the world in general. Even among people who have made a career out of their work in artificial intelligence and machine learning, they still often fall back on science fiction as their representative imagery for AI. We had a lot of Terminators, we had a lot of Skynets, we had a lot of HALs as well. When we were talking through our interviews. And these are people who have made their career out of artificial intelligence and machine learning, understand the difference, but the cultural touchstone for artificial intelligence is still like fiction, science fiction, and very often heavily dystopic science fiction that has very little meaningful comparison to how artificial intelligence actually works in the world around us and where it's visible. Many people might argue that, forget that. I lost the train of thought there, but was that a good answer?
No, thanks a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your question, and hope to see you next year.
Yeah, based on our timing, I'll go ahead and wrap us up here. I want to thank Steve again for sharing his work with us, and thank each of you for joining us. And just to tell you to please be on the lookout for an announcement about the next presentation in our Good Systems Postdoc Interest Group Research Talk series. It will be coming soon. And I hope all of you have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much. Really looking forward to the next talk.